Well, it's Black History Month, and we want to spend some time during each service during February shining a spotlight on some important figures from Black history. One thing I want to announce that's coming up in a couple of weeks, there's this wonderful children's book called Church Hat, which is about the experience of a little boy growing up in his Black church. It was written by Deborah Williams, who goes to church here at MCC Toronto, and it was inspired by the experiences of her uncle John, who also goes to MCC Toronto. She's been gracious enough to give us several, about 2 dozen signed copies, which we're going to be giving to all the kids in Children's Church this month. And she's going to be with us to talk a little bit about the book, what inspired her to write it later this month. So know that that's coming. Today, I want to shine a spotlight on Reverend Pauli Murray. And we talk about, at MCC Toronto, we talk about being a human rights church. And sometimes I think we think of that as almost like a new phenomenon. I think one of the beautiful things we learn in Black history is that faith and human rights have been going hand in hand for a very long time. That progressive Christianity, human rights focused faith is not new. Pauli Murray was someone who lived an incredible life and was part of a lot of really important social change. She was born in 1910. She spent her life fighting for human rights. She fought against people and institutions and systems that said she wasn't allowed because she was Black and because she was a woman. Pauli first got attention back in 1938. She grew up in Parton, North Carolina, and the University of North Carolina said that she couldn't enroll in their graduate school for sociology because of her race. So she fought them on it, and she lost. She never did get into the University of North Carolina, but she got in the news, and she brought a lot of attention to racial discrimination. She got arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a segregated bus in Richmond, Virginia, 15 years before Rosa Parks did. And this happened about 2 kilometers from where I went to seminary, and I never knew for the entire time that I lived in Richmond, Virginia, that something that notable had happened just down the street. Pauli was the first woman to enroll at Howard University Law School, and even though she graduated at the top of her class, afterwards she could not get into Harvard Law School because she was a woman. So she went to work for a law firm in New York, and she had this intern that she mentored by the name of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Ginsburg, who obviously you know, went on to call Murray one of her very biggest influences. In 1966, Pauli was part of a group of women who got together and founded the National Organization for Women. I have a couple other pictures of her that can scroll through. Pauli was just a really important part of history. And in fact, I've seen a lot of headlines that have said, why isn't this person a household name? She really should be. Pauli was also a person of faith and a servant of the church. In 1948, this is one of my favorite stories about her. In 1948, she took a job with United Methodist Women, and they asked her to write a pamphlet about how to resist racial segregation, especially for their churches in the South. In true Pauli Murray fashion, she overachieved so much, she wrote a 700-something page book that became so important for the civil rights movement. Thurgood Marshall used to keep a big stack of that book in his office to give out to people. One of the last barriers that Pauli broke came later in 1977 when she became the first Black woman to be ordained as a priest in the Episcopal Church. In fact, she's the first Black woman, and she may have been the first woman, period, to serve communion in a church in North Carolina. And she served it at a church, I think it's in Durham, where her grandparents had been members when they were enslaved people. Pauli Murray spent her entire life breaking down barriers, and if she had been born in another time, she might have worked to break down another one. That's because if Pauli were alive today, there's a good chance Pauli would come out as transgender. Pauli mostly dressed and acted like a boy when she was young and asked people to use the name Paul or Pete. She wrote in her diary that she should have been born a boy. She wrote about how closely she related to those very few medical articles in the early 20th century that we would call about gender identity. She spent a whole lot of her life trying to get doctors to get her a prescription for hormone replacement therapy. When Pauli's application to Harvard Law School was denied because of her sex, here's how she responded to the admissions committee. She wrote, "Gentlemen, I would gladly change my sex to meet your requirements, but since the way to such change has not been revealed to me, I have no recourse but to appeal to you to change your minds." And as that's a witty response, but I think she wasn't entirely trying to be humorous. She was telling the truth about who she was. Because who she was someone living between the 1920s and the 1980s, and there was a lot less acceptance and understanding of trans identities these days. And like she said, the way to gender transition had not been revealed to her. Pauli Murray is a Black queer saint. So let's celebrate Pauli's life, remember Pauli's story, so that we can be inspired to fight in faith for a world where more and more barriers get broken down.